Hey everyone, this is Nick with Twisted Wrister Hockey, coming at you with oddball hockey topics, homebred statistical analyses, jersey unboxings, and more. Hey there, Twisters, and welcome to my 2018-2019 season predictions report card. So what I've done is I've gone back and looked at my predictions at the beginning of the season, and I've compared those to how the teams actually finished in terms of divisional standings, in terms of point total, and in terms of point total as it compares to all 30 other NHL teams. Now, Neil from Post to Post, he has a video like this every year where he goes back and reviews his season predictions, so I'm definitely taking inspiration from him because he's amazing, and so is the GOAT. And what I've also done is kind of gone in depth to assign a report card, so assign letter grades or marks, if you're in Canada, to my predictions. For those of you who are new to the channel, first of all, welcome. Make sure to hit that big red subscribe button down below for weekly hockey content. All right, everybody, so how did I do with my season predictions? Which ones did I get exactly right? And which ones were real stinkers when looking back on them? Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's go. All right, amigos, so before looking at my report card, let's go over the grading rules. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 criteria for the grade. We're talking about point total for that team on the season. We're looking at divisional standings and where they finished. And we're also going to look at their total points in relation to the rest of the NHL. So where did they finish out of those 31 teams? So basically, I get a higher grade if I match my prediction from the beginning of the year, a lower grade if I'm way off, okay? All right, so we're going to do this by division, and we'll start with the Pacific Division. So the left-hand column is the order that I predicted at the beginning of the season. So I thought San Jose would win the division. I had Edmonton in the basement. So the Sharks finished in second, so I was pretty close there. Vegas, they finished one spot further in third. I was pretty close there. This is the one that really took a turn for the worse. Los Angeles, I had them finishing third, and they finished in eighth. So, of course, I got an F for that. The Calgary Flames, although I only expected them to finish fourth in the division, I actually had them making the playoffs, so I decided to give myself kudos for that. Arizona, I was pretty close there, and they had the season that I expected more or less. And then I had Anaheim, Vancouver, and Edmonton outside of the playoff picture. You can take a look at the column that says finished for divisional standings. We're going to look quickly over at points. So with the Sharks, I predicted 107. They finished with 6 fewer, so not great, but still fairly good. Vegas, they actually disappointed versus what I expected. Los Angeles, that was the real stinker there. Calgary did a lot better than I had expected. Arizona, I actually guessed that they would finish with 86 points. Anaheim, I wasn't too far off with 5 points more than they actually finished with. Vancouver, they finished very close to my prediction, and Edmonton was a little far off, but I still had them definitely outside the playoff picture. So you look at that overall grade on the right-hand side. We're actually going to come back to that toward the end of the video when we actually take into consideration where these teams fared against the rest of the NHL. So next up, we're going to look at the Central Division. So I thought that Winnipeg was going to take the division. I mean, they had a chance to do that at the end of the year, but it didn't quite work out that way. However, that said, I had Winnipeg, St. Louis, Nashville, and Dallas all go into the playoffs. Colorado, I actually predicted them to finish outside of the playoff picture. So even though I predicted them to finish 5th, and they did finish 5th, because they actually qualified for the playoffs, I actually downgraded myself there, and I did that basically for any corresponding teams like that. We're going to look over at point totals. So Winnipeg, I was actually kind of off there. I thought that Winnipeg was going to actually win the President's Trophy, and I mean, really the last month plus of the season, they definitely struggled, and they only finished with 99. St. Louis, well, it's pretty amazing with St. Louis. I mean, here they were the dead last in the league around New Year's, and they actually made the playoffs, and they have a lot of momentum going into it. So I kind of pat myself on the back for it, even though it just looked like a terrible prediction not too long into the season. Nashville was pretty close there, just a couple points off. Dallas, again, not far off there. Colorado, I was almost spot on there. Minnesota, I was a little far off. I knew that they were going to finish outside the playoffs, but not to that extent. And Chicago, I actually got their point total exactly correct. So Central Division, I overall gave myself a B+. So I did better here than I did with the Pacific. Now we're going to go ahead and look at the Metropolitan Division, and this is my weakest division so far. So I thought that Pittsburgh was going to win the division. Yeah, they still finished in the playoffs, so that's okay. Columbus, same thing there. I mean, I'm very thankful that they actually made it on the last day of the season, or the second to last day. Washington, I thought they would experience a Stanley Cup hangover. Carolina, I was spot on with these guys in that I thought they would finish fourth and also make the wild card, and they did. Philadelphia, I predicted them to finish outside the playoffs, and they did. The Islanders, now that was definitely a shocker there. So I thought with 84 points, they would actually be a competitive club with Barry Trotz as the head coach. I thought that Tavares leaving was, I mean, obviously he was a mainstay for the franchise, but I don't think that he had quite as much impact as people were estimating that he did. So that's why I thought they would be okay at 84 points. And then the Devils, I thought that the season before, it was kind of a fluke for them. So that's why I had them outside the playoff picture. And the New York Rangers, of course, they're rebuilding. So looking at the actual points there, so Pittsburgh, not too far off, 5 points off there. Columbus, they finished with 4 points fewer than I expected there. Washington had 3 points more. Carolina had 6 points more. So that's pretty crazy. I thought 93 points would get them into the playoffs. In the Eastern Conference this season, that would not have been the case at all. In the West, yes. Philadelphia, they did a little worse than I expected. The New York Islanders, way better. And the Devils were actually worse than I expected, even though I had them outside the playoffs. And the Rangers actually did a little bit better than I expected. So overall, you can see here that there are definitely some C's, there's a D, there's an F. So overall, I'm giving myself a C+ for the Metropolitan Division. Lastly, we'll end on a pretty good note. We'll look at the Atlantic. So Boston, I had them finishing first, and I mean, God, if they played in any other division, they would have won their division. And only Tampa Bay, of course, finished ahead of them, and they exceeded my expectations by a long shot. Toronto, I had them finishing in third, and that was the case there. Florida, I had them actually qualifying for the playoffs, and so that kind of took a hit when reevaluating things here. They finished in fifth, and they finished the season on an okay note, but they still were kind of disappointing there. Buffalo, now, they looked like they were going to be a playoff caliber team halfway through the season even, but they just really took a nosedive there. The Canadiens were a team that actually surprised a lot of us. I had them finishing in sixth, but they actually finished in fourth. The Detroit Red Wings and the Ottawa Senators, I almost 100% aced those predictions. So looking over at point total, Boston, I only predicted 1 point more than they finished with. Tampa, I was way off. Of course, I had them as a playoff team. Toronto, I was right there, very close. Florida, same thing right there, but I had Florida go into the playoffs. Buffalo, they finished with fewer points than I expected, and I was tempted to actually elevate them to a playoff team at the beginning of the year, but I thought that maybe that was a little bit too premature. Montreal did way better than expected, 22 points higher than my prediction. Detroit and Ottawa, they were only within 4 of what I predicted. So overall, I mean, the Tampa Bay Lightning, that grade doesn't look very good, and of course Montreal doesn't either, but we got some A's aside from those, and so with that said, I gave myself a B for the Atlantic. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at the overall rankings. So this is the order that I thought the NHL teams would finish in terms of highest points to lowest points here, with the Winnipeg Jets winning the President's Trophy. And then if you look at the second column from the right, where it says actual ranking, that's where they actually finished in the NHL. So for example, I had Boston finishing second, and they did finish second in the NHL. San Jose, I had finishing third, and they finished sixth. Tampa Bay, I had finishing fourth, and they finished first. Pittsburgh, pretty close there. I predicted 5. NHL was 7th. Vegas, I thought Vegas was going to basically be at the same point they were last season, and they finished only 15th in the NHL, although I know that they can definitely play above their ranking. St. Louis, I had a little bit loftier of expectations for them than they finished, but they obviously finished in good standing. Let's take a look here. Washington, I thought that they were going to experience a little bit of a Stanley Cup hangover. They still finished in 4th. Los Angeles was definitely the worst on this list. I predicted them to finish 12th in the NHL, and they finished 30th. Calgary, I predicted them to finish 14th, and they finished 3rd this year. They were actually tied in point total with Boston. And then the Carolina Hurricanes, I wasn't too far off there. Colorado, I was just 1 spot away there. And I mean, this is a pretty solid ranking on my part, where it says A, and then F when we look at the New York Islanders. I mean, come on, I think I was almost being generous putting them at 22nd in the NHL going into the season. They finished with the 5th best record. How about that? And then you can also see a D there for the Canadiens, but otherwise, it's almost entirely A's. So I was able to predict the standings pretty well overall in the NHL, give or take a few spots. So I got to give myself some kudos there. So then what I did was I revisited the grade I assigned the teams earlier in this video, and I factored in their overall finish in the NHL. And so basically averaging things out, I'm giving myself a B plus for the Sharks, a C plus for Vegas, an F for Los Angeles, a C minus for Calgary since I underestimated them, an A minus for a very close Arizona Coyotes prediction, A minus for the Ducks, B plus for the Canucks, B plus for the Oilers, for an overall grade of a B minus. If Los Angeles, if I didn't have such a crappy prediction there, then we could be looking at a B plus or an A minus in the Pacific. Going over to the Central, Winnipeg, I had loftier expectations for them than they finished with. My best predictions here were Dallas, and then Chicago and Colorado were pretty spot on as well. So overall, I awarded myself a B plus. In the Metropolitan Division, things ended up getting better when you factor in the NHL rank column. I went from a C plus to an overall B. So when you take a look at these teams, Carolina was my best prediction. The Islanders were clearly my worst prediction, and I'm pretty sure it would be like that for a lot of folks out there. And then wrapping up with the Atlantic Division, so Boston, I was pretty darn close with them. Toronto, I was spot on, A grade. And the same thing with the two teams at the bottom, Detroit and Ottawa. Montreal was my weak point here, but even so, I still finished with a pretty solid B+. So recapping my grades as they were actually assigned to me by my teachers and mentors. So Professor Louie of Vegas Golden Knights coverage, in his course of Pacific Division hockey, I got a B-. With Mr. Nick S. Hawks, in his class, I ended up with a B+ for the Central Division. With Dr. Jillian Fisher of Metropolitan Division expertise, I finished with a solid B, and then in Neil Taylor's class, Neil Taylor of the Society P2P, I ended up with a B+, which is pretty good. So despite some of those shortcomings with teams like LA, Montreal, and the Islanders, I ended up with a grade point average of 3.1, so that's just above a B. So I have qualified for, I think, the Society of Playoffs. All right, friends. Well, that's going to do it for my report card. What do you think? I mean, I actually think I did better than expected. I mean, that last day of the NHL season, I was thinking that maybe I would get my Central Division entirely correct 1-7, but with Nashville winning, they rocketed to the top, and unfortunately, I didn't quite get it right. But overall, I still did pretty well when predicting the standings there and which playoff teams would make it too. Now, in the Pacific Division, I had some struggles there for sure, with LA finishing only with 71 points. I mean, did you think that they were going to finish that low? I know some people had them out of the playoff race before the season started, but I, for one, thought they still had enough to hang on to, especially since they made the playoffs in the years prior, and then they went out and got Kovalchuk, but things fell apart pretty early for them. On the contrary, you look at the New York Islanders, and I actually expected them to be competitive with Barry Trotz, not necessarily be a playoff team though, and they just, from the onset, they just had a fantastic year. So anyway, did you have predictions similar to mine? Did you actually expect other teams to do really well that performed well and above expectations? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up, and for those of you who are new, consider subscribing to the channel. I'm putting out weekly videos on oddball topics, homebrewed statistical analyses, jersey unboxings, and more. This has been Nick with Twisted Wrister Hockey. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you again soon.